Unreal Engine 5 games are finally coming out now, with the first third-party games on that engine releasing on PC and consoles since summer of 2023. For the audience on PC, these launches are both exciting and, well, terrifying. On the one hand, they're very exciting, of course, because we get to see all that awesome eye candy that Epic promised with their first demo of the engine in 2023 years ago. Real-time global illumination with Lumen, seamless level of detail with Nanite, and ray-traced quality shadows without hardware ray tracing, thanks to virtual shadow maps. On the other hand, as I mentioned, it's kind of terrifying, as we have nearly a decade of Unreal Engine 4 games behind us, which honestly has left a kind of bad taste in my mouth due to the massive performance issues encountered in Unreal Engine 4 on PC. With those two conflicting poles of emotion in my mind, I thought it would be great to make a roundup video of sorts where I talk about the good and the great things I'm seeing so far from various Unreal Engine 5 releases that I have played on PC, as well as a number of the not so good things that I'm seeing in these releases. A video that is kind of early barometer of sorts about how developers are coming to grips with the release of that engine on PC, and perhaps what it might mean for the future of UE5 on the platform. I'm not going to be covering any one game though here very specifically, like I said. Rather, I'll be giving a potpourri of impressions after playtesting a variety of games, including the demos of Jusant, RoboCop Rogue City, and the Talos Principle 2, and the games Remnant 2, Immortals of Aveum, Lords of the Fallen, Desordre, Fort Solis, and Layers of Fear. I have a bit to cover here, so let's get right into it. Firstly, with those much lauded Unreal Engine 5 graphical features. So how are they holding up on PC? Well, honestly, I think the first couple releases we have here are leveraging most of the features in a really great manner. And generally, all the games I played here were rather good looking in a variety of ways. In games like the Talos Principle 2, for example, we can see how Crow Team is heavily leveraging all three key technologies of Lumen, Nanite, and virtual shadow maps to great effect. Take Lumen, for example. One thing you can do in a number of UE5 titles is actually turn off Lumen with the global illumination setting in the graphical options menu. This is a global quality parameter in UE5 that you can find in a number of UE5 releases that allow you to turn it down to medium or lower, which will turn off Lumen GI. When we do that, we can see there's a massive difference in lighting quality when Lumen is disabled in a game like the Talos Principle 2. So you can really see how Lumen's local light bouncing and shadowing from the sky lighting is making this image look so different from the fallback SDFAO solution that is used without it. Lumen is just looking great in a lot of the games I played. For example, in the game Jusant, where it's one of the best showcases of Lumen, I would say, for a couple of reasons. For one, because the game almost has no texture detail, so surface lighting is the thing driving most of the game's detail. Secondly, I think it's because the artists and developers behind Jusant really leverage the technology in a great way. They use it to enhance visual contrast in every part of the demo I played. Corners away from the sky get suitably darker and darker the deeper you peer into them, and the sun and the skylight bouncing around the scene objects look suitably convincing. I think Jusant has a really great artist-driven usage of the global illumination, and it's working around Lumen's limitations really well most of the time, where they seem to be placing lights and blockers at times to work around some of Lumen's issues. So Lumen's first impressions, I would say, are definitely great across the variety of titles I played for the most part. I say for the most part because sometimes it's not so great. A good example can be found in the fact that many, in fact nearly all of the titles I tested ship with only Software Lumen enabled. Software Lumen is the version of Lumen that does not leverage the hardware in most recent modern GPUs that accelerates ray tracing. As a result, Software Lumen tries to be cheap to render by reducing quality. And you can see that in a lot of games, like Lords of the Fallen here, which only ships with Software Lumen. The reflections on water surfaces in Software Lumen, for example, leave a lot to be desired, where you can see a lot of screen space artifacts where SSR is used greatly to add in detail. And when you do see the actual reflections from Software Lumen, well, then they're not too great looking. They're pretty blobby and low quality, and there's no dynamic objects in them like characters or vegetation usually. Another issue with Software Lumen that's being shipped in the game so far is that there's a lot of issues with light leaking or instability. Like here in Lords of the Fallen, this orange light from the sun most likely is leaking through the wall here, so our character walking in front of it is causing it to phase in and out of existence. Or here in Talos Principle, another thing you see is that Software Lumen is not good enough for emissive surface lighting to be handled in great detail. So all of the lighting from the power lines that is done with emissives is done in screen space, so it'll disappear and reappear based on where the camera is looking and what objects are maybe getting in front of that lighting. So Software Lumen's quality trade-offs, I think, are very visible in the games that have shipped so far, depending upon where you're looking. Here, I think a lot of titles would do better to also offer an option for hardware lumen, like Fortnite does, and a couple of other titles, such as Desordre. Desordre has a really great menu where it allows you to turn on hardware lumen so you can get better reflection detail and more stable lighting for a small performance penalty. Those reflections look quite a lot better in hardware lumen than they do in software lumen, for example, here. Or take Fort Solis, for example, a great looking game, but it only ships with software lumen enabled in the menu with no option to turn on hardware lumen. Given that how that game relies on a lot of emissive surfaces, a number of scenes in the game have a lot of undersampled lighting issues, where there's obvious boiling in the lighting on walls, or bounce lighting is unstable. With hardware lumen, as we can see here, the undersampling is much improved, so areas get brighter as they should be, and emissives have less issues. So this is why I would like to see hardware lumen as an option in most game menus. But beyond hardware lumen as an option, which most titles I've looked at for this video do not have, it would also be great if other developers of UE5 games followed in the footsteps of the game Desordre that I just talked about. Next to offering the ability to switch on hardware and software lumen depending upon what you want, there's also a lot of other quality knobs here for the lighting, such as the ability to turn on hardware ray traced hit lighting with the Let My Computer Burn option. This makes it so ray tracing is used to shade objects and reflections and not the low quality UE5 surface cache. This will get rid of aliasing and lower resolution textures and other issues you might see in reflections. Desordre also has the ability for you to turn on RTX-DI to make it so all emissive lighting in the world and all direct lighting is done with accurate ray tracing, which adds another layer of realism and stability into the graphics. You can also turn on full-on path tracing there, making it so that objects in reflections, well, have great reflections and accurate bounce lighting in their own right. So this game allows you to go all the way from console level software ray tracing up to super high-end future path tracing. Now, I definitely don't expect every developer to add in things like RTX-DI or path tracing, as they're heavy and, well, they tend to be NVIDIA specific. But I find the ability to turn on hardware ray traced hit lighting really great. And I also find the ability to turn on hardware lumen essential for a UE5 title. Due to the great options in a game like Desordre, you have the ability to scale the game down to lower end hardware, but also have it scale up to higher end hardware for the future. And I think that is a great thing for any PC game. Another interesting thing to note about Lumen in the first titles so far is how it is deployed or it isn't. A game like Remnant 2, for example, doesn't use Lumen at all for its lighting, and it relies on other classical methods and a lot of screen space ambient occlusion. I actually found it a bit surprising that Remnant 2 didn't use Lumen, because the game's whole randomly smacked together levels with different lighting in them seems like a perfect use case for Lumen's dynamic content support. But beyond that, Remnant 2 shows us that not every UE5 title out there is going to always ship with all the big UE5 graphical features present, available in the menus or otherwise. Remnant 2 doesn't have Lumen like I just described. Well, Layers of Fear doesn't use Nanite, for example. Or Lords of the Fallen 2, for example, doesn't use virtual shadow maps. The reasons for these omissions of core UE5 tech are most likely various, and I would imagine testing time and performance concerns on consoles are some of the key reasons there. But one thing I would like to see is the ability to toggle on and off core UE5 features at times in the menu if possible. For example, in Talos Principle 2, you can actually turn off Lumen with the global illumination parameter option, much like you can do in Fortnite. I find that very cool, but it would also be great if you could toggle on and off virtual shadow maps, or even possibly Nanite. Take, for example, Lords of the Fallen. Virtual shadow maps would add a lot to those games' visuals, which I've done for these comparisons you see on screen by using Franz Bauma's Unreal Engine Unlocker, which is a godsend for anyone who's serious about tweaking Unreal Engine games on PC. Imagine if they made it possible to toggle this in the game menu instead of you having to use modding. Wouldn't that be great? It would be, and Gunfire Games, the developer of Remnant 2, actually did just that. In Remnant 2, the graphical menu allows you to turn on and off detailed shadows, which actually toggles virtual shadow maps on and off, giving the ability for the player to run super high quality shadows in the game or older cascaded shadow maps. Once again, more options are always great for the user. Also, Remnant 2 has the interesting option to turn on and off detailed geometry, which actually completely turns off Nanite, according to the console variables I investigated. When it is disabled, the game instead presents the lower quality backup mesh of Nanite geometry and can increase performance. This is a very curious thing, and I don't expect a lot of titles to do this, but it is something that technically the engine supports. For example, if I turn off Nanite using Unreal Engine Unlocker and other titles such as Immortals of Aveum, we can see that it also reverts to the lower quality geometry there, which could potentially improve performance on some GPUs. While I don't expect it, I actually find this a great option to find in Remnant 2, and I would love if other developers maybe also enabled it for their games for an ultra low end option. Getting back to Lumen again, of course, one thing that caught me a bit off guard is that sometimes Lumen will not be incredibly obvious in the title you're playing. In a game like Layers of Fear, I didn't find it too obvious, for example, that Lumen was in play. Or, for example, in Lords of the Fallen, there were a number of scenes in that game where I didn't think that there was really any global illumination at all in the PC version. For example, look at this area here, and look at how all of the objects in the scene almost look like they lack any ambient shadowing, not even like the hint of SSAO. This is very different, for example, to the look that I'm used to seeing with ray traced GI. For example, like that we just saw in Jusant, where there's just that really awesome per pixel shaded look to all the objects in the game. So for whatever reason, and whatever the developers did here, even though the game is using Lumen, they have a number of scenes where they have made it so it doesn't look like it's using Lumen. Basically with this, I mean to say just because a game is using UE5 doesn't mean it will always look like a UE5 game all the time. So that's something to keep in mind for the future, and I really do hope though that developers that are leveraging this new UE5 tech do use it in a way where it serves the gameplay and fidelity at the same time, which it doesn't always do in Lords of the Fallen in certain areas of that game on PC. One last Lumen thing I want to mention is that if you are having trouble with performance in an Unreal Engine 5 game, one thing you should look to be doing is turning down the quality of the global illumination lighting setting and reflection setting one down from the highest. This will turn down the quality in a way that can be obvious at times, depending upon what you're looking at, but it is also an incredible way to save performance and a quick optimize settings tip. It's the way they optimize for Lumen on console by turning down its quality, and it is something that mid-range GPUs should also look at doing on PC. Coming to performance and user experience, I want to praise the first batch of Unreal Engine titles for having a much better image quality options than most UE4 titles. Almost every UE5 title I tested for this video offered DLSS, FSR2, XeSS, and Unreal Engine's TSR. Not all of them did, mind you, but a great majority offered a variety of reconstruction techniques. And this makes sense, as these things are just simple plugins in Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5. This is really great to see, and I like how it was laid out in a lot of the menus here too. Okay, but what about Unreal Engine's best friend, shader compilation stutter? Here I can report both great and not so great things. For one, all of the titles I tested here for this preview handled shader compilation stutter better than nearly every Unreal Engine 4 title that I've tested for Digital Foundry. The reason for this is because most recent versions of Unreal Engine, as in 5.1 and above, have a new just-in-time shader pre-compilation step that'll sort shader permutations ahead of time and prepare them before they're needed on screen. And it can also electively delay them to prevent stutter if the developer sets it up to do that. In theory, this should catch shader compilation stutter, and it does. These games I tested, like I said, had less shader compilation stutter than many UE4 games I have tested. But still, that system is imperfect, and a number of obvious shader compilation stutters were found actually in nearly every single title I tried out there, with some having a good deal more than others. Tails Principle 2, for example, had a select few when playing the game. Like, for example, when I first placed this object in the game world, and we could see an outline effect show up around the object. Yep, and that caused the shader comp stutter. Remnant 2 also had a good few, where like the first time, for example, where I damaged this enemy here, yep, there was a shader compilation stutter. Or the first time I saw this enemy type and effect type, well, there were some really big shader comp stutters there when I was playing. Or Fort Solis, which tended to have more shader compilation stutters than I actually expected. Sometimes really getting in the way of the game there. A few of the games I tested did not have identifiable shader compilation stutter. Those would be the RoboCop demo, Lords of the Fallen, and Desordre. The reason for this, I think, is because these games used the new shader compilation system, and they also had an obvious dedicated pre-compilation step before the game started up. and I think this is rather key. The automated shader compilation system is imperfect and will miss obvious shaders that need to be compiled. But when combined with the old manual system that you could have also found in UE4 games, well then guess what? More shaders were prepared and the game was better for it. So as I see it, UE5 developers at this moment still need to offer a shader pre-compilation step on top of the new just-in-time system to get rid of shader compilation stutter. Otherwise you have cases like in Remnant 2 or Talos Principle 2 or in Fort Solis where you can see obvious shader compilation stutter there, which is not really a great thing to see in 2023. Beyond shader compilation stutter, this first batch of UE5 titles also still has traversal stutter in nearly every single one. So while UE5 does do shader compilation stutter better than UE4 did per default, it still will have issues with frame time spikes that is induced by loading or deloading assets when game worlds are traversed. I found this one to be a bit disheartening, as even simple titles like Jusant managed to show the odd traversal stutter here or there on a big CPU like 12900K. This is a separate issue, of course, from shader compilation stutter, and I'm not sure how much control developers of these games actually have over this issue. The fact that I found it so readily in all the games I played points to it being a somewhat engine side issue, I would say. Traversal stutters definitely have a negative effect on the gaming experience when they pop up. For example, in Lords of the Fallen, where running through this area always induces stutters in and around the staircase and as you go through the hub area in the game. It doesn't look and feel good when you run through this area of the game, for sure. At best, like we can see here with the Ryzen 5 3600 versus the 12900K, bigger CPUs with more single core performance will reduce the amount of stuttering that occurs and the size of the stutters. But you will still see them even on really big CPUs, which means everyone out there is going to be affected by traversal stutters, much in the same way everyone is affected by shader compilation stutters. They can have a very negative effect on the game experience, such as in Lords of the Fallen, and they can ruin otherwise gorgeous moments, where I would say the atmospheric aspect of video gaming is completely undermined by the stuttering that is happening on screen. One thing that is important to note about traversal stutter that I'm seeing in the first batch of UE5 games is the fact that these UE5 games are often single thread limited and make poor usage of modern multi-threaded processors. Now, I've shown this in the past when I talked about UE 5.2 and the Electric Dreams demo, where it barely scaled on more CPU threads. The same thing can be found in this first batch of UE5 games. For example, if I run around Lords of the Fallen 2 with 8 P-cores enabled on an i9-12900K, well, it's pretty easy to look at the utilization there, and we can see how 2 threads are just pegged and being blasted at full, while others are much less encumbered. Here we're probably looking at UE5's render thread and perhaps its RHI thread. Or maybe it's the game thread. Either way, we're seeing that some threads are much more encumbered than others. And if we do performance testing, we can see that more threads does not equal more performance. In fact, it will decrease the performance. Look at Lords of the Fallen again. Running around through the game world there showcases that the best performance configuration on the Core i9-12900K is actually to decrease the amount of cores and threads the game has access to. The fastest running configuration is 6 cores, and adding more cores and threads after the fact actually decreases performance a little bit, by around 10% for example if you use the full 12900K. I don't think this is a good look. And to contrast it with something better like Cyberpunk 2077, we can see substantial gains in performance by increasing cores above 6 in that game. Something that I would love to see in UE5 games. This has been an Unreal Engine issue for quite a long time, but here I think we can have a bit of hope actually. Based on Epic's presentations at the Unreal Fest in 2023, they are looking to increase the engine's multi-threading capabilities, which till this point has been legacy holdover from Unreal Engine 4 to a larger degree. They're looking to break up the RHI and render thread to be more parallel and reduce unnecessary work. And based upon that presentation where they showed big increases in performance when running the Matrix demo, it seems like this could be one of the biggest updates for CPU performance in Unreal Engine history. And it's definitely a long time coming, and the changes are going to start happening with Unreal Engine 5.4. So better CPU performance is definitely coming in the future to more recent versions of the engine than the games I've been playing for this video. And I hope what this means is that there's going to be less stutter when we play these games that have large big worlds that are traversed quickly, such as that we see in Lords of the Fallen, as less things encumbering a single thread means there's going to be less spikes to frame time. One thing I want to talk about last is texture quality. Now, the virtual texturing that is enabled by default when you use Nanite in Unreal Engine 5 makes it so that the games shipped so far in UE5 actually tend to have really great texture quality. It's hard to complain there. The developers in all the games I tested, other than Jusant of course, are really using that texture quality enabled by virtual texturing to a great degree. And they're doing it in a way that is very VRAM efficient. Most games I played for this video maxed out at a little over 8 GB when playing at 4K DLSS quality mode on an RTX 4090. But it must be said, perhaps this low usage of VRAM is also a little too aggressive. In a number of the titles that I played for this video, there were some obvious texture popping that would occur very close to the camera at times, even on an RTX 4090, which of course has gobs of VRAM to spare, which is obviously not being put to use here to prevent texture streaming. For example, in Fort Solis, a lot of textures at times, like for the UI or for the Martian landscape, would take a while to phase in, even while moving through the game world at a slow pace. Or here in Lords of the Fallen, where textures phase in often on camera cuts in a way that is very noticeable. Here I would like it for games to offer more VRAM control for how much VRAM is being used for caching, or to just be generally more greedy with VRAM in an automatic way. And with that out of the way, I think I've reached the end of this video covering the first releases of Unreal Engine 5 in very broad brushstrokes. In general, all the titles that I played for this video were beautiful in their own right. Some, like Fort Solis for example, I thought were rather stunning looking. With the right artwork and direction, Unreal Engine 5 titles can look absolutely stunning, and that's what these first releases definitely tell me. I also love seeing the different image reconstruction techniques being offered in a lot of these games. Not all of them had every single image reconstruction technique, but a good chunk did, and that was awesome to see. Still, Unreal Engine 5 has some legacy issues here in the engine that are rearing their ugly heads still in 2023, and it did sour a couple of the titles that I tested. Traversal stutter and shader compilation stutter was still there and are still actually big issues, even if it is better than before. In a title like Fort Solis, which I just praised, it was actually distracting to the point of me not wanting to play the game after a certain amount of time, because every single time I saw something new, I could almost expect a shader compilation stutter to occur there. This is telling me that UE5's new automated shader cache system is not good enough yet to be wholly relied upon. Titles like Lords of the Fallen, for example, did it much better, where they combined that with a pre-compilation step, and in that game I couldn't find any shader compilation stutter really. Some other issues I saw is that most games shipped with too little control in their graphical options. It would be great to allow users to turn on and off hardware Lumen, or even things like virtual shadow maps if they want to trade off performance for quality. Excluding Disorder, most of the games I tested just used software Lumen and shipped with that and had very basic options menus. And with that being said, we're now at the end of this video. I did say a lot, but I hope you also enjoyed my broad look at Unreal Engine 5's first releases on PC. If you did enjoy this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. Support us on Patreon to get years of our content in high quality for download. Other than that, comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.